Labour and the Conservatives at war as Kemi Badenoch and Mel Stride claim that the Chancellor's got her sums wrong. She says that the budget and spring statement will make us all £500 better off. They claim actually workers will be losing £3,500 from their pay packets.
And of course, you can't go anywhere without mentioning Donald Trump. What does the leader of the opposition think about his tariff policies?
Kamal, you very diligently brought a notebook today. I haven't got one, so I'm looking at my notes on the notes on my phone, which is quite unprofessional, but you have done a great job of writing down
everything, yes.
The economic impact of April the 1st. And April the 1st has become this day where we can make an assessment of how much more our bills are going to go up. And you've written down some of the figures.
I have. It's very much back to the old tax and spend row between the Conservatives today and Labour on the other side. We went through at the last budget about how many costs were approaching for businesses and for working people. All those bills start from April. So actually, although the announcement was made last autumn, this is the moment when the sort of rubber hits the road for all of us. So let's go through a few of those. Stamp duty. So first-time buyers could be paying up to £11,250 more for when they buy a house. And house prices actually fell in December, which means that the housing market is pretty weak. Road tax, that's going to be going up by £5. Electric vehicles will lose their exemption for road tax, which means they'll start paying it, starting at £10, but it will go up after that. Older diesel cars, if you've got an old diesel vehicle, you'll be faced with an economic bill of £5,500.
Christ, that's me, I've just realised.
Really?
Yeah, I've got
Council
an old
tax. That will go up between 5 and 10%. Now, national insurance on business, Camilla, one of those big issues where Labour kept claiming this wasn't a tax on working people. But every business, or many businesses, have said they will pass on the costs of the national insurance rise on businesses through lower wages and higher prices. So we will all be paying for that. And also, do you remember the hairdresser that we had on the podcast? Yes, podcast last week, saying that business rates were also a problem, and that's because the COVID business rate relief has also been lowered.
Then we've got private schools obviously having to pay more because of the VAT rise. And now, of course, they're also losing that charitable rate relief. So that's being taken away. And that particularly affects private schools with large playing fields because it's done on sort of acreage. On energy bills, Kamal, contrary to Ed Miliband, the Climate Change and Energy Secretary's claims that we will be £300 better off when it comes to paying for energy. Not quite the case. Actually, they're up £111 a year. And water's also up £10 a month, even though our rivers and seas are becoming increasingly polluted.
Yeah. And then finally, the TV licence for the BBC, that's up £5, and most of our mobile and broadband bills will be higher. The problem with all these things is that, of course, many bills go up, and they may not be directly to do with the government. But if people are feeling worse off and they're worried about bills, and all the polling does say that, this then becomes a political issue, and that is why Kemi Badenoch and Mel Stride have decided that today was the day to attack what they described as Labour's jobs tax.
Before we get into the Tory attack lines on Labour, Sir Keir Starmer has been speaking today, and he's pointed out that because the minimum wage is going up, some people will get a pay rise.
I think for most people, they would say the cost of living crisis is ongoing and they feel the pressure financially. That's why it's so important that we make good on our pledge that people would feel better off. And the national living wage going up today by an average of £1,400 is going to affect millions of people. So in their pay packet this month, and obviously for months to come, they will now be getting more money in. That's alongside the other work we've done. Interest rates have been cut 3 times since we've had a Labour government. So anybody with a mortgage knows that the rates are coming down. And of course, on average, wages are going up now more quickly than prices. So I'm not denying there are
you
bills.
acknowledge people are going to be feeling it.
I acknowledge
still.
that with bills coming in, people see that rise, and that is a pressure.
That was Keir Starmer speaking to Sky News earlier. Let's hear a little bit about how Kemi Badenoch is trying to gain some political momentum by making this a big dividing line between the Conservatives and Labour.
Even the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility is clear. Labour's jobs tax will hit workers, not just businesses. And the real cost? By the end of this Parliament, families across Britain will be £3,500 worse off. That is not a small cut. That's food on the table. That's energy bills. That's rent or a mortgage payment. Labour ministers think this is pocket money. Just this morning, the Prime Minister was boasting that he had given people a pay rise. He does not get it. Why are we in this mess? Because Labour simply do not understand how the economy works.
She was also there with the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, who was crunching some of the numbers. And what this is about, isn't it, Kamal, is the Tories restoring their reputation for kind of fiscal competence. To be fair, you and I discussed it last week on the Daily Tea. The polling has shifted, and now the Tories are seen as more economically competent than Labour, which is something, it's a door that they can push upon. However, the trouble with this, and we were at CCHQ, Conservative Campaign Headquarters earlier, a lot of press were there. One wonders whether the public's actually listening to either of these two on economics. It's tricky, isn't it?
I think that's their biggest problem. The polling that we've been looking at over the weekend and we had in our podcast on Friday showed that Kemi Badenoch as Prime Minister is very low in the polls, actually a long way behind not only Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer on who would make the best Prime Minister, but also behind Ed Davey. So that's her big problem. And will the party around her be patient for long enough? Some of the polling that is on her side is that lots of people do directly blame Rachel Reeves for what has been described as the cost of living crisis, and lots of people are struggling to pay the bills, and they do connect that to the Labour Party, and that is damaging and quite worrying for Labour.
Also, I think the repositioning of the Tories as a party of business is a really good idea, because I think small and medium-sized businesses particularly feel completely disenfranchised. They don't think the government's listening to them. Actually, I mean, we've interviewed ministers, I've interviewed them on the GB News show. They seem to make out that everything's great with business, when we've heard precisely the opposite is true. We haven't heard anyone say anything positive about the budget or the spring statement. So I think that comment from Kemi Badenoch saying that even Labour's business backers are having buyer's remorse was quite a good attack line. What was also interesting, I thought, was the press conference was mostly dominated by questions about Trump's tariffs. Again, that's something that the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, addressed this morning.
Well, I don't think anybody wants to see tariffs.
But you acknowledge we are going to get them.
Well, look, we're working hard on an economic deal, which we've made rapid progress on, and I hope we can make really speedy resolutions on. But look, the likelihood is there will be tariffs. Nobody welcomes that. We're obviously working with the sectors most impacted at pace on that. Nobody wants to see a trade war, but I have to act in the national interest. And that means that all options have to remain on the table.
That's Keir Starmer appearing again on Sky News. Kemi Badenoch being very careful not to appear to be divisive on the side of the UK, so is backing Keir Starmer's position. This is what she had to say about the arguments around tariffs.
Tariffs are not good for global economies. We are a trading nation. We're an island nation. Tariffs are terrible for us. But there's a big difference between criticizing policy and criticizing an individual. My job is not to go out attacking leaders of foreign countries. My job is to talk about what works for the UK national interest. Tariffs are not good for national interest, and there's no difficulty in saying that at all.
There is a dividing line here now because the Liberal Democrats are advocating a much tougher approach with Donald Trump. Not necessarily that anyone's listening to Sir Ed Davey, not least after he was hopping around on a hobby horse yesterday in quite a bizarre election campaign launch. I mean, absolutely odd, really. Was criticised by Robert Jenrick and others for not taking politics seriously enough when people are being hit in the pockets. On this Trump tariff war, it's tricky, isn't it? So much is now resting on us doing this trade deal with America. And it is a valid point to say that Labour haven't helped themselves out here. The criticism of David Lammy and Sadiq Khan and others hasn't paved the way for great relations across the pond. Secondly, it's been pointed out that the civil servant who was kind of heading up those negotiations, Crawford Falconer, he was let go by Labour. It's also been made clear to me that Karen Pierce, the former UK ambassador to the US, was actually smoothing things out with the Americans. And then suddenly she's replaced with a political appointment of Peter Mandelson, who himself has been critical of Trump and the Republicans. So it's not as if they didn't have noticed that this was going to be a problem. Donald Trump hasn't just been talking about imposing tariffs on others since he was in office, and I mean previous presidency and this one. He's been talking about it since the early 1980s.
And he's been doing it as well. In the 2016 to 2020 presidency, he put tariffs on steel. It was always obvious that if he won, this was coming. The free trade deal, Camilla, I remember interviewing the Commerce Secretary in the US between 2016 and 2020, the Treasury Secretary between 2016 and 2020, when all the discussion was, we're very close to a trade deal, any moment now, within the next year. We are still 5 years later talking about the possibility of a trade deal. Now, it does appear there's more momentum. Keir Starmer has another problem, not only about the relationship that Labour had in opposition, the very antagonistic relationship that Labour had in opposition with the Trump, with the possibility of a Trump victory, but also that is his approach, which is softly, very different from Canada, very different from the European Union, who've both said we are going to retaliate. Is that the best way, Keir Starmer, to tackle Donald Trump? This idea that Donald Trump only recognises strength when it comes to negotiations, and that Keir Starmer is trying to play nice. If he doesn't get this free trade carve-out from the tariffs that are very likely to be announced tomorrow, that policy will be seen to have been a complete failure.
I would love it if Mr. Remain, the man who tried to block Brexit at every turn, is rescued by Brexit in being able to carve out his own deal aside from the EU, his beloved Brussels that he so loves. It would be quite ironic and funny. I did like Kemi Badenoch's response to the blocks in the way of a trade deal. They're the same two things all the time, aren't they? Hormone-injected beef and chlorinated chicken. Let's just have a listen to her response on that.
It's not true that the sticking points have been hormone-fed beef, etc. This is what gets whipped up in the press and by campaign groups. The sticking points will be actually far more fundamental. It's always been about quotas, how much an industry can withstand. With all the trade deals that we dealt with, we made sure that our SPS standards were always at the highest level. But nobody is going to be forced to eat chlorinated chicken. I don't even think most chicken in the US is actually washed with chlorine. This is it's a myth that has expanded quite a lot over the years.
She's right to point out that these sort of things have become false totems. This is the irony. Has anyone in the history of the UK ever gone to America and rejected beef burgers and chicken burgers on the basis of how they might be prepped? I do get that farmers in this country are going to be really worried. You know, they were very, very badly clobbered by our deal for New Zealand lamb. We remember all that. But this idea that we can't possibly take imported meat from America because it's in some way inedible is for the birds. Has nobody ever been on holiday to Florida and eaten the food there?
I think the health issues are, as you say, not the most important issue. The big issue is actually the trade impacts of tariffs. But let's just listen to Donald Trump. We're expecting this huge, what he's describing as Liberation Day tomorrow, the announcement of between 10 and 20% tariffs on all goods imported into America. Particularly the big ones for us will be cars and pharmaceuticals, where we have billions of pounds of trade with America. Let's just hear why Donald Trump thinks this is going to work for America.
If you look at the history and you look at what's happened to us, you go to certain places, go to Asia, and you take a look at every single country in Asia, what they've done to the United States in trade. And by the way, in military in a certain way, you look at, you take a look at trade with Asia, and I wouldn't say anybody is treated as fairly or nicely, and but we are going to treat them. We're going to be much more generous to them in terms of heart. We're going to be much more generous than they were to us.
I saw this email this morning, Kamal. Obviously, lots of economic experts are trying to quantify what effect a tariff war is going to have on the world. And one figure I saw was £1 trillion. And I thought, my goodness me. The estimates vary, don't they? How much it might carve off our own gross domestic product, how much it might carve off our own GDP, gross domestic product. 0.6% is a figure that's been mentioned, but on the radio this morning I heard somebody predict it might be 1% off. And we've already got a really fragile and flatlining growth figure. What impact could this actually have on the whole?
It's a problem, real problem for Rachel Reeves. And when you talk about, £1 trillion, it sounds sort of ridiculous and the public don't understand it. But any of our listeners and our viewers who have got an equity ISA, anyone who has investments in stocks, anyone who has a pension that is obviously invested in stocks will be seeing the direct effects now, because Donald Trump's announcement that he wants to go for these very, very heavy tariffs, he's already announced tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, has meant that the stock market, because of the lack of business confidence, because this will put up costs for business, has come down a lot. The major stock markets in America have taken a real pummeling. So there is a direct link to what Donald Trump is doing. Economic confidence in America, the recession risk in America has now been upped, and our pensions, our savings, our investments, and that is why so many people are so opposed to tariffs.
Also, one gets the feeling that inflation target coming down to 2% by 2027, it's looking a bit dicey.
There's one bit of possible glimmer of better news would be, it only comes because the economy is struggling so much. Will the Bank of England feel obliged to cut interest rates more aggressively?
Coming up next, well, the Chancellor in the building behind us said last Wednesday that we would all be £500 better off as a result of Labour's economic plan. We now hear from the Tories saying that she's got her figures wrong. Are they suggesting that the Chancellor was lying in her spring statement, Kamal? Mel Stride, Shadow Chancellor, joins us now. Thank you for joining us on the Daily Tea as ever. Always good to see you. Great to see you. Great to see you. You've been crunching these numbers, but this is what we want to know. Rachel Reeves said in the House of Commons last week for the spring statement that people would be £500 better off as a result of Labour's economic plan. You're now saying that we're actually going to be 3,500 down. So are you saying that the Chancellor was lying last week in the House of Commons?
So what I'm saying is, firstly, in terms of whether you're better off or not over the next 5 years, if you look back at our budget, our last budget when we were in government, we're going to be worse off compared to that. And the second point is that what we're looking at with this jobs tax is the direct impact of that tax on people who are workers in working families. Now, Labour would have you believe that all of this tax is going to land on employers. None of it gets passed on to working people. Well, the OBR is clear as night and day, make it clear that 75% actually of the impact of that tax, net of this transfer they're making to the public sector to compensate them, is being borne by workers. And if you add that up across all the families in the country that have at least one working member, you come to £3,500 over the rest of this Parliament.
So I do understand that, but you've done the melomathics. And therefore, do you like what I've done?
That's very good, Camilla. Yeah, well done. Yeah.
Well, we had momentum, and now we've got
we didn't even
melomathics.
practice that.
But just quantify this £500 that she promised last week then on Wednesday. Because if we're not going to be £500 better off, you're saying we're worse off, then she has technically misled the House of Commons, hasn't she?
Well, I think they're two different things.
Okay.
So I think what she's referring to is what economists call real household disposable income and how that moves around across the forecast. That's where she gets her number. My point is that if you compare that with where we were when we were in government and what the forecast was then, we would have had people being better off than this current forecast is showing. But look, if she hadn't brought in the national insurance hikes on employers, workers would be a lot better off. And the reason why they're not is a lot of the costs or impacts of that tax are being passed through to working people by way of lower wages and increased unemployment. So that's what's going on here. So it is workers that are being impacted by these tax moves.
Now, Mel Stride, you were asked, or Kemi Badenoch was asked, given the Conservatives' economic record, voters are just not ready to listen to you. You may do all this analysis. It may be correct on the numbers, but the problem you have from the voters' point of view is that they're no longer ready to listen to you. And the polls suggest that you are still a long way behind both Labour and Reform.
Well, look, we're probably 4 to 4.5 years away from a general election. We've had a very significant electoral defeat. We lost the trust of the public over a number of issues, and we've spoken at length about that. What we must do now is firstly hold the government to account, and that's what the announcements we're making today around the jobs tax are about. And I held Rachel to account at the dispatch box last week at the time of the emergency budget. But secondly, we've got to do that deep thinking about what the policy platform will be for us as a party if we're going to fundamentally rewire the economy in a way that leads to increased growth and productivity and leaves us in a strong and resilient position as an economy to face the kind of headwinds that economies face. Now, that's a complete reverse of what this government has done. It's taxed and spent and borrowed to the extent that we've ended up with growth being halved this year, according to the OBR, interest rates higher than they would otherwise be, and the Chancellor blew all her economic fiscal headroom from the last budget and more, and has had to repair that. That's not a good position to be in, facing into those challenges going forward.
What I can't quite get my head around is, obviously we had this OBR growth forecast which was downgraded from 2 to 1%. We've now got talk that our GDP could shrink by 1% because of Trump's tariffs. So how can the OBR still be predicting that we're going to be in a growth situation in the coming years? I mean, surely now the Chancellor does have a point about the world events that have affected the British economy. If we lose 1% of GDP, we could go into recession, couldn't we?
Well, world events and risks are always there, and I think there was a world in which one could have seen potentially President Trump becoming president, and he's always talked about tariffs, so that is one challenge. There's also the challenge of a sort of security decoupling of the states with Europe, and that requires increased defence spending, so that's another challenge. There are also some challenges, I think, around where productivity growth is going in our country and the OBR's forecasts at the moment, or whether they're too optimistic or not. But look, we know there are challenges for our economy. Some of those things you can't directly do much about, but what you can do is build a resilient economy so that when you face into those challenges, you're able to be resilient enough to get through them. And that's not what this government has done. So they've taxed, they've borrowed, they've spent, they've stoked inflation, they've destroyed jobs and growth, and they've left us in a far weaker position as a consequence. And that's going to make it more difficult to face into some of the challenges that will be coming.
But what do you think are the chances of recession?
Well,
Mel,
I wanted to ask you.
Mel.
I wanted to ask you, Mel Stride. Is there now a chance, given those headwinds that we are facing, both for government policy reasons and because of world events, that we could be looking at a recession this time next year?
So I don't think I'm going to get into the forecasting business. They say that astrologers are there to make economists look good. And what they mean is that economists are notoriously bad at trying to forecast the future. But look, what we do know is if there is a full-blown trade war, that will be very difficult for an open economy like ours. The OBR actually says it'll be about 0.6% off growth, and it could rise to 1% if there are retaliatory tariffs that are put in place. The important thing is to try and get ourselves carved out from those US tariffs, and that comes to the issue of a trade agreement. And the problem that the government, or the problem with the government and their approach, is they've been far too slow off the mark. It was 5 months before the business secretary sat down with his opposite number to discuss a trade deal. There were also these rather silly remarks that were made when Labour were in opposition about Trump and his entourage, which didn't help when it came to the relationship at the beginning. And I think we may end up paying the price for all of that, but we'll know very soon.
Shouldn't we be a bit more aggressive on tariffs? It's time to take the gloves off it, isn't it? And say, if Donald Trump puts tariffs on UK companies, pharmaceuticals, cars, whatever it might be, that we should put in place reciprocal tariffs to ensure that we are not flooded by American goods when we can't sell to the American economy.
Well, what we should do is look at every single particular aspect of any tariff policy that the US comes forward with and take those judgments in the round, looking at how significant those sectors are to us and the impact on consumers. But at the macro level, what you can't escape is if you have a round of tariffs on your exports, that does some damage. If you have reciprocal tariffs in response, it may not be enough to make that other country change what they're doing, but it does add to the damage that you do to your own economy. So they are judgments that have to be taken in the round. And of course, we're talking about tariffs on different lines of trade, for example, and you'd have to look at each one of them individually.
Is your prediction for the budget in autumn that taxes will go up?
I think there has to be a reasonable chance of that. I mean, look, if history is a guide to the future, look what happened to the headroom that the Chancellor had back in the autumn with her first budget. That evaporated, plus in excess of £4 billion. She went underwater. She's now rebuilt that headroom through this scrabbling around with welfare changes and so on. It remains to be seen whether that stands the test of time. But this comes back to the fragility point. If you have an economy that doesn't have enough fiscal headroom in it to withstand the kind of things that we're discussing, you can put yourself in a very precarious position where you might end up having to come back for more. And it may be that that's what she has to do in the autumn.
Mel Stride, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea.
A great pleasure. Thank you. Lovely to see you.
Sorry, I'm just having a little chuckle at melomatics. I'm not sure if that's going to be on a poster anytime soon, but there you have it.
His officials did write it down and said they were going to use it in the future.
Fabulous.
It was absolute genius. What I'm feeling here that the Tories have realised that they can go back to those tax attacks that are always so toxic for Labour. Outside in the foyer here at Conservative Central Office is the picture of the double whammy tax attack they used on Tony Blair all those years ago. And we're getting very similar vibes here with the red Labour's job tax. In the end, Labour always know that their biggest political problem is they can't be trusted with the public's money. And the Conservatives are pushing that narrative. And on a day like today, when all these bills are going up over the next week, some of that may get some cut through, but my worry is, Camilla, that the public are just not listening to the Conservatives. They're listening to Reform and they're not liking Labour, but there's not much space for the Tories within that triangle.
We'll be striding into tomorrow's podcast, 5 p.m.